Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Saturday, June 1st, day 239 since October 7th. The most significant news is that US President Biden has put a ceasefire hostage proposal on the table. He said that this was a proposal that was initially accepted by the Israelis, and he's challenged Hamas to also accept the deal. This was announced yesterday on Friday. If agreed to by Hamas, it would lead to a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, the release of hostages, and ultimately the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the enclave. Describing the plan as a path to, quote, a durable end to the war, President Biden said the suffering has to stop and it's time for this war to end. It's a three-phase plan. It would echo previous proposals. This was the news last night. There's updates since then. The deal on the table would release all the hostages. It would also get much more humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Ultimately, it would bring an end to the fighting. The president, according to the White House, has spent months of intensive diplomacy working with Israel, Egypt, and Qatar. And according to statements from the White House, they've been putting pressure on Hamas, saying that Hamas needs to take this deal, which was offered by Israel, and world leaders are calling on them to do so. So President Biden said this is truly a decisive moment. Israel's made their proposal. Hamas says it wants a ceasefire. This deal is an opportunity to prove whether or not they really mean it. This would be an opportunity to end the suffering of the Palestinian people, the people of Gaza, and all that they've experienced over the last 8 months. According to President Biden, too many innocent people have been killed in this war, and the deal on the table offers a roadmap to end the suffering for people in Gaza and also the hostages' families who've waited so long for their loved ones to return. The White House also said that Israel can make this offer without further risk to their own security, because the US government's perspective is that Israel has so devastated Hamas's forces over the past 8 months that they no longer have the capacity for another attack at the same level that they did on October 7th. According to the White House, its military capacity has been significantly eroded. Its leaders are dead or in deep hiding. Israel will retain the right to continue its efforts to bring them to justice. This deal is the best path to both end the crisis in Gaza and to ensure Israel's security today and over the long term. President Biden also called on Israeli leaders to stand behind this deal no matter what. So it's presumed that President Biden preemptively announced this using an agreement that Israel had agreed to previously to put pressure on both Netanyahu and Hamas. He re-emphasized Israel will always have the backing of the United States so that they will be able to defend themselves. Here's a few more specifics about the deal itself. So one is the restoration of calm on the northern border to allow people to be able to return to their homes. Two is beginning to rebuild Gaza alongside of the international community. We heard in our meetings that there's not an expectation that Israel will retake responsibility for the destruction in Gaza, which is in violation of international humanitarian law. So the plan as of now is that the international community, Arab partners, and Palestinians and Israelis would come together to rebuild Gaza. Three, that they would pursue an Israel that's more regionally integrated, including through normalized relations with Saudi Arabia. And four, that there would be conditions for a future of freedom and self-determination for the Palestinian people, which ultimately would include a two-state solution that would provide a better future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. President Biden said for months, people all over the world have called for a ceasefire. Now it's time to raise our voices and demand that Hamas comes to the table, agrees to the deal, and ends this war that they began. The proposals at 3 phases. The first phase would be 6 weeks of a ceasefire. Israeli forces would withdraw from populated areas of Gaza. This would include Rafah and other areas. There would be a release of a number of hostages in this first phase. In exchange for the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners that are held in Israeli jails, Palestinians would be allowed to return to North Gaza, and humanitarian aid would increase to 600 trucks per day of aid. And then there would be the start of the restoration of essential services. Just a reminder that negotiating over humanitarian access is also a violation of international law. Humanitarian access should never be limited as a term of war. The second phase would secure a permanent cessation of hostilities together with the return of all hostages and the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. And then the ceasefire from the first phase would continue as long as all parties in negotiations to finalize the arrangements for the second phase. And the third phase would see the return of any final remains, bodies of hostages that are still in Gaza, the start of an internationally backed multi-year reconstruction program. So from that, those were the big announcements yesterday. In response, Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, said that the war would not end until all the hostages are returned and Hamas is eliminated. So honestly, it's sounding like even though Israel initially agreed to the proposal, it's very much sounding like Israel, the Israeli government's not currently accepting it. So Netanyahu's public response has been that their war agenda has not changed. This morning, Saturday morning, Netanyahu gave a speech and said that he reiterated he would not agree to a permanent ceasefire in Gaza as long as Hamas still retains governing and military power. He did not explicitly endorse or reject this proposed plan, but two Israeli officials confirmed that Mr. Biden's proposal did match a previous ceasefire proposal that had been given a green light by the War Cabinet. But analysts are saying that the timing of Netanyahu's speech, the first thing the next morning after Biden put out this call for the war to end, essentially is putting the brakes on President Biden's hopes for a speedy resolution to the war. And we've been hearing all week officials from the Israeli military saying that we're going to see this war last, this bombing of Gaza, the ongoing, what many people are calling a genocide in Gaza, that we're going to see this last through the end of the year. So we're not hearing anything different coming from Prime Minister Netanyahu. Hamas's response, they put out an official statement stating that they consider the U.S. position and the reinforced conviction to put an end to the war on Gaza. They essentially said that they're in favor of it, but analysts have said that that seems to be coming from the political wing of Hamas, and ultimately that Sinwar and Mohammed Diaf, who are in Gaza, will have to be the ones that implement the details of the deal. And so it seems that there's not a formal response from Hamas as of yet. So the proposal seems to be the same terms that we've been hearing about. Netanyahu's still saying Hamas has to be destroyed. The US's perspective is that Hamas can't be destroyed. Some analysts are saying that this might just be the Biden administration seeking to look like they're doing something, but there's no real change. Hamas has been saying they are not going to agree to any type of negotiated settlement until Israel agrees for the war to be over. And Israel is saying they're not going to agree for the war to be over until Hamas is eradicated. So it seems like there has been no real change. There also has been a question about whether or not the guilty verdicts related to former President Trump might have allowed Biden to think he's off the hook in terms of his current policies via Gaza. In other news, two more U.S. officials have resigned over the Gaza war, saying that the Biden administration is not telling the truth about Israeli obstruction of humanitarian assistance to the more than 2 million people who are still trapped and starving in Gaza. One of them is Alexander Smith, a contractor for USAID, who said he was given the choice between resignation or dismissal after preparing a presentation on maternal and child mortality amongst Palestinians. The presentation was canceled by USAID shortly before it was to be delivered last week. And then another resignation happened last week on Tuesday. A State Department official from the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, Stacey Gilbert. And she said she was leaving because of an official finding by the department that Israel was not deliberately obstructing the flow of food or other aid into Gaza. The total number of Biden officials who have now quit because of President Biden's policies about Gaza is 9. Other significant news is that the U.S. joined with the UK in an attack on Houthi rebels in Yemen, and 16 people were killed. Airstrikes were carried out in the last 24 hours or so, targeting Houthi rebels in Yemen. 16 people were killed, 35 were wounded. That's according to media reports from the region. If confirmed, this would be the deadliest strikes in months-long campaigns against the Houthis. U.S. Central Command said that the strikes destroyed 8 Houthi unmanned vehicles and hit 13 other targets. And then in Israel, Hostages and Missing Families Forum announced that they are continuing to protest outside of all the ministers' houses in Israel, including Prime Minister Netanyahu. And in Israel, they've decided that they're going to have to establish a private security unit for the Netanyahu family because of the increasing number of protests against the Prime Minister. The Israeli army said that airstrikes killed 3 key Hamas operatives in Gaza over the last few days. So that was significant in terms of the news about Gaza. And Egypt's state TV reported that a meeting between the US, Egyptian, and Israeli officials is set to take place tomorrow in Cairo. A key point that they'll be discussing is reopening Gaza's Rafah crossing. Egypt is insisting that Israel withdraw its forces from the crossing. And escalations and hostilities have continued in northern Israel between Hezbollah and the Israelis, and fires broke out in parts of Kiryat Shimona in northern Israel following rocket fire from Lebanon. So that's an update on the news these last 24 hours. So there is a proposal on the table. We can certainly pray for a miracle and hope that it proceeds and moves forward from a political front, but we will continue in our efforts nonetheless. So continue to pray and engage and act, and don't give up hope.